Greetings, dear friends, and welcome. We're so delighted you could join us once again for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift peacefully away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening takes us back to the 19th century, to an era of profound transformation and tumultuous change. Picture, if you will, the air thick with coal smoke hanging like a shroud over industrial cities, factories growing like tired, weary giants across the landscape, their chimneys belching darkness into already grey skies. And there, amid this industrial revolution that was reshaping the world, sits a man with a famously unruly beard in the hushed reading room of the British Library, scribbling furious notes in the margins of ancient books. His name, Karl Marx. His mission, nothing less than to explain why the world felt so fundamentally broken and why, just maybe, it didn't have to stay that way forever. Before we properly begin our exploration of Marx's extraordinary story, just a brief, gentle thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind at the end of your day, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It genuinely helps other curious, thoughtful minds discover these stories. And we're always deeply curious about your reflections and thoughts. Please let us know in the comments below what you think of Marx's life and ideas, and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, the word Marxism gets thrown around quite a lot these days, sometimes as a political slogan, sometimes as a scare word meant to end conversations before they begin. But strip away all the noise, all the political baggage accumulated over more than a century, and at its heart, Marxism is really just a question, a profoundly human question. What if work didn't have to hurt? What if the things we make with our own hands, the clothes we sew, the food we grow, the houses we build, the technologies we create, actually belong to the people who make them, rather than to distant owners who never set foot in a factory? Marx spent his entire adult life chasing that idea through bankruptcies and evictions, through exile after exile, through decades of poverty, and yes, through quite a lot of very bad cups of coffee in various European cafes. Of course, history took his theories and ran absolutely wild with them. Revolutions erupted in his name. Manifestos were written and rewritten. Governments rose and fell, claiming his philosophy as their foundation. But tonight, we are not here for the fireworks of revolution or the grand sweep of political movements. We're just here to meet the man behind the myth, a brilliant, stubborn, deeply flawed and profoundly human thinker who desperately wanted a fairer world and devoted every waking hour to understanding why fairness seemed so elusive. And now, as the day winds down and the evening settles around us like a comfortable blanket, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential thinker. This is the bedtime biography of Karl Marx. Our story begins on a spring day in 1818 in the quiet riverside town of Trier, nestled in the German Rhineland. It was a place where ancient Roman ruins crumbled gently into the slow-moving Moselle River, where vineyards stretched sleepy and green under the summer sun, and where centuries of history seemed to press down on every cobblestone street. Here, in an unassuming but respectable house on Brückengasse Street, a boy named Karl Heinrich Marx took his first breaths on May 5th. His father, Herschel Marx, who had recently changed his name to the more German-sounding Heinrich, was a respected lawyer with Enlightenment ideals dancing perpetually in his head. He was a man of his time and place, caught between tradition and modernity. Heinrich had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism in 1816, more for career prospects and social acceptance than any spiritual awakening. This was the reality of life for Jews in Prussia. To advance professionally, to practice law, to provide for one's family, one often had to abandon the faith of one's ancestors. Young Karl would inherit that pragmatic, sometimes painful streak, along with something far more combustible, a burning resentment of systems that forced such impossible choices. The Marx household hummed with intellectual energy and animated conversation. Heinrich filled the home with volumes by Voltaire and Rousseau, by Kant and other philosophers of the Enlightenment. These were dangerous books in conservative Prussia, books that questioned authority and tradition, books that suggested human reason might be more important than royal decree. Meanwhile, Karl's mother, Henrietta Pressburg Marx, kept the pantry stocked with Dutch cheese, a reminder of her Amsterdam roots, and the children stocked with old Dutch proverbs about thrift, practicality, and the value of hard work. Young Karl absorbed it all, the books, the late-night debates between his father and visiting lawyers and intellectuals, the sense that the world was not fixed and immutable but might be reshaped by reason and human will. He was a precocious child, simultaneously charming and infuriating to his teachers. Even as a boy, he displayed an almost unsettling intensity, as if he were constantly interrogating the world around him, demanding that it explain itself. Trier itself was a city of contradictions, much like the young Marx growing up within its walls. Ancient Roman architecture, the Porta Nigra, that massive black gate that had stood for 17 centuries, coexisted with medieval guild halls and Baroque churches. But looming over all of it was the oppressive bureaucracy of Prussia, which had annexed the Rhineland just 3 years before Karl's birth. The region still felt French in many ways, having been under French rule during the Napoleonic era, and its citizens had tasted revolutionary ideals before being thrust back under conservative German rule, auntie. By the time he reached the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium, the local preparatory school, Karl's teachers noted two things with increasing concern. First, that the boy wrote essays of startling depth and sophistication for his age, grappling with philosophical concepts that challenged even educated adults. And second, that he possessed what one instructor diplomatically called a most unsettling habit of interrogating every premise placed before him. He wasn't content to accept what he was told. He needed to understand the why beneath every statement, to excavate the foundations of every argument. At 17, as he prepared to leave Trier for university, Marx penned his graduation essay titled Reflections of a Young Man on the Choice of a Profession. On the surface, it dealt with conventional themes: the union of the faithful with Christ, the importance of finding one's calling. The language was appropriately pious for a Prussian gymnasium, but between the carefully constructed lines pulsed something quietly radical. A vision of humanity united not by religious dogma or national loyalty, but by shared struggle and common purpose. It was as if the young man already sensed the theme that would consume his entire life, that our earthly bonds matter infinitely more than heavenly ones, that human solidarity could be more sacred than any church doctrine. His headmaster, perhaps sensing the trouble that lay ahead for this brilliant but troublesome student, wrote in Karl's leaving certificate that while the student showed undeniable brilliance and intellectual promise, his work suffered from an overabundance of intellectual energy, perhaps the most German way possible of saying the boy thought too much and question too much for his own good. Meanwhile, the Rhine valley around him whispered of older stories and older conflicts. The ruins of Roman amphitheatres, where gladiators had once fought and died for the entertainment of crowds, stood alongside medieval guild halls, where craftsmen had once controlled their own labour and their own lives. And overshadowing it all was the Prussian bureaucracy that now governed Trier with an iron efficiency, crushing any hint of political dissent, any whisper of republican or revolutionary sentiment left over from the French era. These contradictions piled up around young Marx like the terraced vineyards climbing the hillsides along the Moselle, ancient and modern, free and fettered, sacred and profane. Marx would spend his entire life dissecting such contradictions, though he couldn't possibly have known it yet as he prepared to leave home. For now, he was simply a bright young man of 17 with a shock of dark hair, burning dark eyes, and a restlessness that no amount of Rhine wine could soothe. His father dreamed that Karl would become a lawyer like himself, respectable, comfortable, financially secure. It would be a continuation of the Marx family's hard-won bourgeois stability, their climb from the margins of Prussian society toward its respectable centre. But the boy who had grown up surrounded by Enlightenment books and Prussian censorship, between Jewish roots and Lutheran conversion, between French revolutionary ideals and German conservative reaction, was already nursing questions too dangerous for courtrooms. In October 1835, at the age of 17, he left for the University of Bonn, carrying a trunk of carefully packed clothes, a head absolutely full of half-formed ideas, and a heart already primed for rebellion against every form of authority he would encounter. The quiet banks of the Moselle would see him only occasionally after that, the prodigal son returning between exiles, each time a little more radical, a little more convinced that the world needed not careful reform within existing structures, but revolutionary change from the ground up. The boy who would unmake the world had begun his journey. The university years arrived like a storm, shaking loose whatever bourgeois restraint still clung to young Marx like an ill-fitting coat. Bonn in 1835 was a revelation. All tavern brawls and duelling scars, Rhine wine flowing freely, and young men from across Germany coming together to drink, debate, and occasionally attend lectures. It was a far cry from Trier's sleepy vineyards and his father's respectable parlour. 18-year-old Karl dove in head first with characteristic abandon. He joined the Poets' Club, where students gathered to read revolutionary verse and drink themselves into states they mistook for philosophical enlightenment. He ran up considerable debts, purchasing fine tailored coats, Spanish cigars, and round after round of drinks for his new friends. There was even one particularly rowdy night that ended with young Marx getting arrested for drunkenness and disturbing the peace, carrying a firearm while intoxicated, according to the police report, though the firearm was apparently just a broken sabre from someone's collection. His father's letters from Trier grew increasingly desperate and alarmed, mixing financial reprimands with genuine paternal concern. "Your wild rampaging through the nocturnal streets," Heinrich wrote in one particularly exasperated missive, "might perhaps be excused in a foolish teenager, but not in a future statesman and respected member of society." But Marx wasn't destined for statesmanship, and some part of him already knew it. The year at Bonn was also significant for another reason. It was there that Marx became secretly engaged to Jenny von Westphalen, the daughter of Baron Ludwig von Westphalen, a liberal aristocrat and family friend. Jenny was 4 years older than Karl, stunningly beautiful, highly educated, and by all accounts could have married into money and secure social position. That she chose instead a penniless, temperamental student with no clear prospects says something profound about both her character and Marx's early charisma. But Heinrich Marx was growing increasingly concerned about his son's direction, or lack thereof. The debts, the drinking, the neglect of legal studies, none of this boded well. So in the fall of 1836, he arranged for Karl's transfer to the University of Berlin, hoping that Prussia's capital and its more serious academic atmosphere might impose some discipline on his wayward son. Berlin was indeed different. Where Bonn had been all youthful excess and romantic rebellion, Berlin was austere, serious, and intellectually intense. The University of Berlin's lecture halls smelled of ink and burning ambition, humming with the ideas of one man in particular, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who had died just 5 years earlier, but whose philosophy still dominated German intellectual life like a benevolent ghost. Hegel's philosophy was dense, systematic, and revolutionary in its implications, though Hegel himself had been quite conservative politically. His central insight was that history progressed through dialectical clashes of opposing forces. Thesis meets antithesis, and from their conflict emerges synthesis, which becomes the new thesis, and so on. Everything was in motion, everything was becoming, and contradictions were not problems to be solved, but the very engine of historical development. This idea electrified Marx. For the first time, he encountered a philosophical system that matched his own intuitions about the world, that nothing was fixed, that conflict drove change, that what seemed permanent and natural was actually historical and contingent. He threw himself into studying Hegel with an almost frightening intensity, spending days and nights in his room reading and rereading the master's works until his eyes burned and his head spun. He joined the young Hegelians, a circle of radical thinkers who had taken Hegel's dialectical method and turned it against the very Prussian state that Hegel had supported. If everything was in motion, they reasoned, then surely the Prussian monarchy and the Christian church were also temporary, historical phenomena destined to be swept away by the dialectic of history. What had been a respectable philosophy in Hegel's hands became, in theirs, a weapon of critique. Nights blurred into days in smoke-filled rooms where the young Hegelians debated religion as the opium of the people, a phrase Marx would later make famous, and monarchy as an outdated relic of feudalism. They met in wine cellars and coffee houses, these young intellectuals and aspiring revolutionaries, convinced they were thinking the future into existence. The transformation in Marx was startling and alarming to those who knew him. The law student who had arrived in Berlin in 1836 with dreams of a respectable legal career now scribbled passionate, dark poetry about hellish darkness and the gods' downfall. His verses were terrible, overwrought, melodramatic, filled with supernatural imagery, but they revealed something of his inner turmoil. One poem, The Player, depicted a violinist playing so furiously that he seizes the world and hurls it into the abyss. It was adolescent angst, certainly, but it was also a young man grappling with genuinely radical ideas about transforming the world. His father, watching this philosophical rebellion unfold through increasingly erratic and alarming letters, grew frantic. "For God's sake," Heinrich pleaded in one letter, "when will you start living like a proper Christian and stop consorting with these atheistic intellectuals? You're throwing away every advantage, every opportunity. But the religious skepticism that had quietly informed Heinrich's own pragmatic conversion now blossomed in his son into something far more militant and uncompromising. Marx had already slipped his leash. He stopped attending law lectures altogether, letting his official studies wither on the vine while he devoured philosophy, history, and political economy. He read voraciously the ancient Greek materialists, the French socialists, the British political economists. He covered the margins of books with notes and arguments, developing the habit that would later make the British Museum's librarians despair. In 1836, he suffered some kind of breakdown, physical and mental exhaustion from overwork, and the stress of living on the edge of poverty in expensive Berlin. He retreated to the countryside for several months to recover, and there, walking through forests and small villages, he began to see beyond the purely philosophical questions that had consumed him. The poverty of the peasants, the arrogance of the landowners, the way economic power shaped every social relation. These material realities started to penetrate his consciousness in new ways. By 1839, Marx was researching his doctoral thesis on the difference between the Democritean and Epicurean philosophy of nature, an examination of ancient Greek materialism that was really a sly rebuke to the idealist philosophy dominating Germany. The ancient atomists, he argued, had understood that matter was primary and consciousness secondary, that the world was made of physical stuff in motion, not of ideas or spirit. It was dry, academic philosophy on the surface, but revolutionary in its implications. He submitted his dissertation not to conservative Berlin, where his radical associations would have doomed it, but to the more liberal University of Jena, receiving his PhD in April 1841 at just 23 years old. Dr. Marx imagined an academic career, perhaps a professorship, where he could teach and write, developing his ideas in the relative safety of university walls. But the Prussian government had other ideas. When his mentor and friend Bruno Bauer was fired from his teaching position for radical views, specifically for publishing work questioning the historical authenticity of the Gospels, Marx understood immediately that the university gates were closed to him. The Prussian state was cracking down on the young Hegelians, viewing them, quite correctly, as a threat to the established order. And so, the young philosopher stepped onto a different path, one that led not to ivory towers and academic respectability, but to radical journalism, revolutionary politics, and eventually into the waiting arms of a certain factory owner's son named Friedrich Engels. But that meeting, like so much else in Marx's life, would have to wait a bit longer. For now, in 1841, Marx left Berlin with a degree he couldn't use, ideas too dangerous for Prussia, and a restlessness that would carry him across Europe and into history. The party student had studied himself into becoming a revolutionary. The hangovers would certainly continue, but now they'd be accompanied by something far more potent and far more dangerous to the established order. A rising fury at the world as it was, and a burning, all-consuming determination to remake it from the ground up. The young man, who had once written terrible poetry about destroying the world, was now acquiring the philosophical tools to actually attempt it. The ink-stained radical found his first real battleground not in the streets, but in the pages of a struggling liberal newspaper. Cologne, 1842. Marx, now 24 years old, and brimming with untested theories and explosive ideas, took the helm of the Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal publication backed by progressive Rhineland businessmen who wanted a voice against Prussian absolutism, but perhaps didn't fully anticipate just how radical their new editor would prove to be. The newspaper became Marx's laboratory, his testing ground for ideas about society and politics. Each editorial was a carefully aimed dart at Prussian authoritarianism, at religious hypocrisy, at the self-serving rationalizations of the wealthy. He wrote with a biting wit and sarcasm that made his articles popular, even among those who disagreed with him. His prose had a certain electricity to it, a combination of philosophical depth and journalistic punch that was rare in German writing of the time. He wrote about the plight of Moselle wine growers crushed by unjust taxes, about freedom of the press as a fundamental right, about the corruption of bureaucrats. He mocked the censors who redacted his articles, sometimes printing articles with blank spaces where the censor's cuts had been, making the censorship itself part of the story. He was learning to write not just for intellectuals, but for a broader audience, honing that signature style that would later make the Communist Manifesto so powerful, that potent mix of scholarly rigour and biting, accessible sarcasm. The paper's circulation tripled under his leadership, much to the government's increasing dismay. Workers and liberal merchants alike bought copies to read Marx's latest skewering of authority. But the articles that would ultimately doom the newspaper and launch Marx towards his true destiny were a series he wrote about the law on thefts of wood. This might sound like a dry, technical subject, but Marx turned it into a damning indictment of how law serves property owners at the expense of the poor. For centuries, peasants had exercised customary rights to gather fallen wood from forests for fuel. But as forests became more valuable commodities, the Prussian state had passed increasingly harsh laws criminalizing this practice. Gathering deadwood, literally picking up sticks that had fallen to the ground, could now result in fines, imprisonment, or forced labour. Marx's articles on this subject marked his first serious engagement with questions of property rights, class conflict, and how law functions to protect the interests of the wealthy. The poor, he wrote with barely contained rage, have been declared poachers for gathering fallen wood, while the true poachers are those who have stolen the common forests from the people. It was in wrestling with this seemingly minor issue that Marx began to see how deeply economic interests shaped everything else: law, politics, even philosophy itself. The Prussian authorities pounced. The paper represented a threat not just to this or that policy, but to the entire system. When Marx published an article criticising the Russian Tsar, Prussia's important ally, that was the final straw. The paper was ordered shuttered in March 1843. Its final issue, published on March 31st, was printed entirely in red ink as a defiant farewell, with Marx writing a bitter valedictory article about the death of press freedom. Marx, now blacklisted across German states and unemployable as an editor or academic, faced a stark choice: silence and compromise, or persuade or exile and continued struggle. He chose exile with typical dramatic flourish, but not before one important personal milestone: marrying his sweetheart Jenny von Westphalen that summer, on June 19th, 1843, in the small Protestant church in Kreuznach. Jenny was taking an enormous risk. She was 30 years old, considered quite old for a first marriage in that era, and turning down other suitors from wealthy families to marry a penniless, unemployable radical with no prospects. Her family was scandalized. Her half-brother would later become a highly reactionary Prussian interior minister and would make Marx's life as difficult as possible. But Jenny believed in Karl, believed in his genius, and believed that the intellectual adventure of their life together would be worth the material hardships. It was a belief she would be tested on repeatedly in the difficult decades ahead. After a honeymoon in Switzerland, the newlywed couple crossed into France. Paris in the autumn of 1843 was a revelation, particularly after the oppressive atmosphere of Prussia. The air literally smelled different, of revolution and cheap tobacco, of possibility and danger. The city's cafes buzzed with political exiles from across Europe, with radical ideas that would have gotten you imprisoned in Berlin or Vienna. Paris was then the undisputed capital of European revolutionary thought. Every utopian socialist, anarchist, republican, and democrat who'd been forced out of their own country seemed to have washed up on the banks of the Seine. Louis Blanc was developing his ideas about social workshops. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was writing What is Property? His famous answer, property is theft. Secret societies met in back rooms to plot the overthrow of various European monarchies. It was intoxicating for a young radical like Marx. Here, Marx discovered something Prussia had never allowed, a space where radical ideas could breathe, where you could actually publish critiques of existing society without immediate arrest, where intellectual and political life could flourish in relative freedom. He plunged into the city's intellectual underground, debating with anarchists late into the night at the Café de la Régence, arguing with utopian socialists about their impractical schemes, absorbing the revolutionary energy of the city. It was during these fevered months in Paris that Marx began his lifelong project. Stripping away capitalism's polished, respectable surface to expose the grinding machinery beneath. He started reading the British political economists seriously, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, James Mill. He was searching for the economic foundations beneath all the philosophical and political superstructure he'd been studying. The French utopian socialists, Saint-Simon, Fourier, and their followers, dreamed beautifully about cooperative communities and harmonious social organisation. But to Marx, they were building castles in the air, imagining solutions without understanding the actual mechanisms of the system they wanted to replace. They dream, he wrote in his notebook, but they do not analyse. Late one evening, hunched over a desk in their cramped apartment on Rue Vanneau, Marx showed Jenny his latest notes. "These French thinkers," he muttered, running his ink-stained fingers through his hair, "they dream beautifully, but they build castles in the air. They don't understand that you can't simply wish a better world into existence. You have to understand the actual economic forces that shape this one." His fingers left smudges on the page as he traced connections between abstract philosophy and concrete economics, between idealistic theories and the actual workers who moved history forward with their labour. Jenny, ever his first and most important editor, pointed to a particularly dense passage filled with Hegelian jargon. "Too abstract," she said gently but firmly. "If you want to change things, you'll need to speak to people's actual lives, not just to other philosophers." That lesson would stay with Marx for the rest of his life. The need to ground theory in reality, to make philosophy speak to the lived experience of workers and ordinary people. As Paris sharpened his thinking, he co-founded the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher, German-French Annals, a radical journal intended to bring together the best of German philosophy and French socialist politics. The journal lasted exactly one issue before its Prussian financial backers got cold feet and pulled their support. But that single issue, published in February 1844, contained Marx's seminal essay on the Jewish question and his contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. These essays marked his first major break from liberal politics and purely philosophical analysis. In On the Jewish Question, Marx was responding to Bruno Bauer's argument that Jews needed to abandon their religion to achieve political emancipation. Marx's argument was more radical. Political emancipation itself wasn't enough. You could grant everyone equal rights under law, but if society remained economically divided between owners and workers, between rich and poor, then real human emancipation remained impossible. The essay's startling conclusion: true freedom required more than political rights or religious tolerance. It demanded the overthrow of the economic system that alienated humans from their labour and from each other. It was in the introduction to his Hegel critique that Marx wrote the famous line, "Religion is the opium of the people." But the full context is important and often overlooked. He wasn't just dismissing religion as a scam or delusion. He wrote, "Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." Religion, in other words, was both a response to real pain and an obstacle to addressing the actual sources of that pain. As winter settled over Paris, Marx's beard grew thicker and more unruly. His critiques grew sharper and more systematic. Prussian spies embedded among the German exile community took note of the dangerous young intellectual holding court at various left-bank cafes, filling notebook after notebook with increasingly revolutionary ideas. By January 1845, the French government, under pressure from Berlin and nervous about its own radicals, issued an expulsion order against Marx and several other German editors and writers. The revolutionary honeymoon in Paris was over after less than 16 months. Marx packed his books yet again, this time with Jenny pregnant with their second child, and headed for Brussels, which at least tolerated political exiles if they promised not to publish anything about current Belgian politics. He didn't know it yet, but his years of wandering exile across Europe had only just begun. Nor could he guess that his most fateful encounter, with a sharp-eyed textile heir who'd just published a scathing indictment of conditions in English factories, waited just around the corner, about to transform his life and his work in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The radical journalist was about to meet his other half, his intellectual partner, his financial lifeline, and his closest friend for the next 4 decades. The encounter that would alter the course of history happened almost by accident in the most ordinary of settings. Paris, August 1844. A café near the Rue Vanneau, where the air hung thick with coffee steam, tobacco smoke, and revolutionary talk. Friedrich Engels, just 24 years old, but already hardened by 2 years working in his father's Manchester textile firm, had sought Marx out after reading his essays in the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbücher. Their first meeting, a year earlier in Cologne, had been cool and awkward. Marx, already establishing himself as a philosophical heavyweight among the young Hegelians, had dismissed the young businessman as just another utopian socialist, someone with more enthusiasm than rigour. Engels, for his part, had found Marx arrogant and prickly. They'd parted without much impression on either side. But this time was different. Engels arrived armed with something Marx couldn't resist: data. Hard, concrete, specific evidence of how capitalism actually functioned in its most advanced form. He slid a manuscript across the cafe table, its pages smudged with factory grime and ink, the product of his time embedded in Manchester's industrial hell. The condition of the working class in England laid bare the horrors Engels had witnessed firsthand. children with spines curved permanently from 16-hour shifts in cramped factory spaces, workers coughing up blood and cotton lint from mill air so thick you could barely see across the room, entire families, parents and children, trading every shred of dignity for pennies per day, living in cellars flooded with sewage, dying of diseases that had been conquered among the middle class. Marx, who had theorized brilliantly about alienation from the comfort of libraries and philosophical treatises, found himself staring at the visceral, bloody reality. As Engels spoke, his voice low but urgent, about wage slavery and the machinery of exploitation, about how the factory system quite literally ground human beings into profit, something clicked in Marx's mind. We finished each other's sentences, Engels would later recall in a letter to a friend. It was as though we'd been having the same conversation in our heads for years, only separately. Now we could finally have it together. By last call that evening, they were already plotting a collaboration. Engels would provide the empirical observation, the concrete details of how capitalism functioned on the ground. Marx would provide the systematic analysis, the philosophical framework to make sense of it all. Together, they would create something neither could achieve alone, a comprehensive critique of the capitalist system grounded in both theory and reality. Their partnership became the engine of revolutionary theory for the omietyczalnictwo next 4 decades. Engels, the practical observer, who'd worn holes in his boots walking through Manchester's slums, grounded Marx's sometimes abstract brilliance in concrete detail. Marx, the relentless systematizer, transformed Engels' observations into sweeping historical analysis. They complemented each other perfectly. Engels had a gift for clear, accessible writing that Marx sometimes lacked, while Marx had a depth of philosophical insight that Engels recognized and deferred to. Their first collaboration was The Holy Family, published in 1845, a blistering and often sarcastic takedown of their former young Hegelian friends, particularly Bruno Bauer. The writing sessions ran deep into the night in Marx's Brussels apartment, fueled by cheap wine and Engels' seemingly bottomless supply of cigars. "The only luxury I allow myself," Engels would joke, though he'd soon inherit a substantial share in the very capitalist machinery he despised. Jenny Marx, watching from the doorway while nursing baby Jenny, their first daughter, would smile at the sight of her husband actually laughing for once, his usual brooding intensity lightened by Engels' dry wit and irreverent humour. Engels became not just Karl's intellectual partner, but a beloved family friend, Uncle Engels to the Marx children. But their bond went far beyond intellect or even friendship. When Marx was expelled from Paris in early 1845, Engels followed him to Brussels without hesitation, even though he was still just a clerk, living on scraps of allowance from his father. Later, as a partner in the family textile firm in Manchester, a position he loathed but accepted for financial security, Engels would become Marx's reluctant but unwavering lifeline, funneling portions of his bourgeois income to support the Marx family through decades of poverty. "Someone has to make money," Engels would sigh in letters to Marx, "and it certainly wasn't going to be you, my dear fellow." It's one of history's great ironies. The man who would become Marx's most important collaborator and financial supporter was a capitalist living off the surplus value extracted from English factory workers, and funding the writing that would eventually call for capitalism's overthrow. When the two men needed to test their theories against reality, they embarked on a 6-week tour of English industrial slums in the summer of 1845. Manchester's textile mills became their classroom. They walked through neighbourhoods where multiple families crowded into single rooms, where children worked barefoot on factory floors slick with oil and machine grease, where the average life expectancy for a working class man was 17 years. 17 years compared to 40 for the middle class. The misery they witnessed there hardened their conviction that capitalism wasn't just flawed or in need of reform, but fundamentally, structurally doomed to produce such misery as long as it existed. These aren't exceptions or abuses. Marx wrote in his notebook after one particularly harrowing factory visit. This is the system working exactly as it's designed to work, extracting maximum value from human labour while paying minimum subsistence for that labour. By 1847, their ideas had crystallised enough to attract the attention of a small revolutionary organisation called the League of the Just. German artisan workers and intellectuals who'd been meeting in secret, plotting vaguely about worker revolution. At a smoky pub meeting in London, called the Red Lion, Marx and Engels encountered these earnest but theoretically unsophisticated revolutionaries. The League asked them to draft a new statement of principles, something to replace their old motto of all men are brothers with something more concrete and scientific. Marx and Engels agreed, but only if the League would reorganise itself on more rational principles and adopt their analysis of class struggle. The result, written primarily by Marx, but heavily influenced by Engels' input and editing, would become the most famous political pamphlet in history. As Engels paced reading the draft aloud in Marx's Brussels apartment, with Jenny and their children sleeping in the next room, the assembled German workers leaned forward, caught by the power of the prose. The document's famous final lines, "Workers of the world, unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains," wasn't just rhetoric. It was a battle cry forged in the crucible of their partnership, combining Marx's philosophical fire with Engels' first-hand knowledge of worker suffering and revolutionary potential. The theorist had found his witness. The philosopher had found his empiricist. The exile had found his anchor. It was a partnership born in a Parisian cafe that would go on to shake empires, funded by the textile profits of Ehrman and Engels' Manchester, one of capitalism's contradictions made flesh. The League of the Just, soon to be renamed the Communist League, had been whispering about revolution for years. A scattered network of German exiles, disgruntled tailors, earnest clockmakers, and idealistic printers meeting in London back rooms and Brussels cellars. They were sincere, passionate, and politically naive. Their previous attempts at revolutionary theory had been heavy on mysticism and light on practical analysis. But when Marx and Engels arrived in late 1847 with their manifesto draft, the whispers became a roar. The group renamed itself the Communist League at their London Congress in November 1847, shedding its old conspiratorial mysticism and vague utopianism for something bolder. A scientific blueprint for class war. Marx was commissioned to write the new statement of principles, though in reality he and Engels worked on it together, with Engels drafting an initial catechism-style document and Marx transforming it into something far more powerful. That winter in Brussels, Marx's cramped apartment at 42 Rue d'Orléans became the League's unofficial headquarters. Jenny Marx, now mother to 3 young children, Jenny, age 3, Laura, age 2, and baby Edgar, served tea and bread to a rotating cast of shoemakers and printers, while her husband paced the small room, dictating passages that would become the Communist Manifesto. The children played quietly in corners, already accustomed to their home being invaded by serious men speaking urgently in German. Engels, ever the practical editor, made frequent trips from Paris to Brussels, trimming Marx's sometimes overly Germanic, philosophical sentences into razor-sharp prose. He had an ear for what would move people, what would stick in their minds. A spectre is haunting Europe, Marx began one midnight session, pausing as Engels scribbled a marginal note. Too poetic, Engels wrote, but then crossed it out. The phrase stayed. Its ominous rhythm was absolutely perfect for the coming storm they were predicting. The actual writing process was chaotic. Marx, famous among his friends for procrastination when faced with deadlines, nearly missed the League's deadline entirely. The London Central Committee finally had to send him an ultimatum. Finish the manifesto within a week or face further measures. This threat, combined with Engels's nagging and Jenny's quiet insistence, finally got Marx to complete the draft in late January 1848. The manifesto itself was less a traditional political document than a kind of literary detonation. Just 23 pages in its original German edition, it reduced all of human history to a single fundamental law. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman. History was the story of oppressors and oppressed locked in constant conflict. But the manifesto did something revolutionary theorists before Marx had failed to do. It praised capitalism. Not to defend it, but to understand it. The bourgeoisie, Marx and Engels wrote, had accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. Capitalism had destroyed feudalism, united nations through commerce, created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. This was crucial to their argument. They weren't romanticising some pre-capitalist past or calling for a return to medieval guild production. Capitalism was historically progressive, a necessary stage in human development. It had created the industrial working class, had concentrated workers in factories and cities, had made them collectively powerful in ways scattered peasants had never been. The writing crackled with caustic wit and devastating insights. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honoured and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage labourers. Everything sacred had been profaned, everything solid melted into air, all that was holy made mundane. But capitalism, for all its revolutionary energy, contained fatal contradictions. It produced wealth by creating poverty, created its own gravediggers in the industrial working class, was prone to ever-worsening crises, and most fundamentally, the system of private property and wage labour alienated workers from their own creative capacities, from the products of their labour, from each other, and from their own humanity. The solution? Revolution. Not utopian communities or gradual reform, but the working class seizing political power, abolishing private property and the means of production, in creating a society organised around human need rather than profit. The manifesto outlined immediate demands: progressive income tax, abolition of child labour, free public education, alongside the longer-term vision of a communist society. It ended with that immortal rallying cry: "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." The timing could not have been more perfect or more coincidental. When revolution erupted in Paris in February 1848, toppling the monarchy of Louis Philippe, in just 3 chaotic days of street fighting, the manifesto suddenly seemed prophetic. Marx had predicted revolution, and here it was, spreading across Europe like wildfire. Within weeks, revolutions broke out in Vienna, Berlin, Milan, Venice, Budapest. All across the continent, the old order seemed to be collapsing. Marx, expelled from Brussels by nervous Belgian authorities, raced to Paris as exiled German radicals hailed him as their theorist and prophet. The French provisional government actually invited him back to the city that had previously expelled him. By April 1848, Marx had made his way to Cologne, where he launched a new radical paper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, New Rhineland newspaper, urging German workers to push beyond merely bourgeois, liberal reforms toward genuine social revolution. The paper became the voice of the revolution's radical wing, with Marx as editor and Engels as a regular contributor. Engels, ever the man of action alongside his theoretical work, took up arms with revolutionary fighters in Baden during the armed uprisings of 1849. He wrote articles about military tactics and personally participated in several skirmishes against Prussian troops. "I'm the only intellectual in the revolutionary army who knows which end of a rifle to point at the enemy," he joked in a letter to Marx. But the tide turned fast, brutally fast. By the summer of 1849, the conservative forces had regrouped. Prussian troops crushed the rebellions in Germany with overwhelming military force. The Habsburg Empire reasserted control in Austria and Hungary. France's Second Republic gave way to Louis Napoleon's increasingly authoritarian rule. The revolutionaries who'd seemed poised to remake Europe were scattered, imprisoned, or executed. Marx's paper was shut down by Prussian authorities, its final issue published on May 19, 1849, printed once again in defiant red ink. "We have no compassion, and we ask no compassion from you," Marx wrote in his farewell editorial. "When our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for the terror." Facing certain arrest if he remained in Germany, Marx fled to Paris, but the French government, now far less friendly to radicals than it had been a year earlier, immediately expelled him again. This time, his options were narrowing. He was banned from Germany, unwelcome in France, and Belgium refused him re-entry. England, that island of relative political tolerance for foreign exiles, became his only option. In August 1849, Marx arrived in London with Jenny, now pregnant with their 4th child, and what little remained of their possessions after multiple hasty escapes across borders. Engels, after a harrowing escape through Switzerland following the collapse of the Baden uprising, followed a few months later. As they regrouped in London, Marx in a damp Soho tenement, Engels gradually making his way back to Manchester and the family firm, the scale of their failure became painfully clear. The revolutions of 1848 had collapsed. The old order had restored itself, often more repressively than before. The Communist League was in tatters, its members scattered across Europe or imprisoned. And their manifesto, that brilliant document that was supposed to guide the revolution, had sold barely 100 copies. Yet in that cramped exile, in those dark days of defeat and disillusionment, something curious and unexpected happened. The manifesto began circulating underground, copied by hand, smuggled into Germany in bales of cotton, hidden in false-bottomed trunks, passed hand to hand in French worker circles and English Chartist meetings. A text written in desperate haste was slowly, quietly becoming scripture for a movement just beginning to stir. Marx couldn't know then that his pamphlet's most famous lines would one day echo in every language on earth, that it would inspire revolutions he couldn't imagine in places he'd never heard of. For now, there was only the damp London cold seeping through thin walls, the cries of his malnourished children in the next room, and the slow, stubborn, often heartbreaking work of thinking a new world into existence, while the old one seemed determined to crush anyone who dared imagine alternatives. The 23 pages had been written. Now they would have to work their way through history, one reader, one worker, one revolutionary at a time. London in the 1850s greeted the Marx family like a damp, unrelenting cough that never quite goes away. Their first lodging was a 2-room flat on Dean Street in Soho, one of London's poorest neighbourhoods. The flat smelled perpetually of stale bread, wet wool, and the accumulated misery of too many people living in too small a space. The walls were so thin they could hear their neighbours' arguments verbatim, could track the daily rhythms of the half-dozen other impoverished families crammed into the decrepit building. The Marx family, Karl, Jenny, and their 4 young children at this point, shared these 2 small rooms with all their possessions, which amounted to very little. There was no running water in the flat. Chamber pots served as toilets. In winter, they couldn't afford enough coal to heat both rooms, so they all crowded into one, huddling together for warmth. Marx, now stateless and penniless, without any prospect of employment or income, spent his mornings trudging through London's notorious fog to the British Museum's reading room. This magnificent domed space, opened in 1857, became his sanctuary, his workplace, his second home. Here was a temple of knowledge where he could warm his frozen fingers while studying parliamentary reports on factory conditions, where he could access books he could never afford to buy, where he could lose himself in research and forget, temporarily, the grinding poverty waiting for him at home. The British Museum attendants came to know him well. That German doctor, they called him Doctor because of his PhD, who occupied the same seat from opening until closing, surrounded by teetering stacks of books, his marginal notes growing increasingly furious as he traced capitalism's veins through dry economic data. Seat G7 became his spot, and he was territorial about it. His daughter Eleanor later recalled that he treated that seat as though it were his personal property, growing irritated if anyone else sat there. But while Marx pursued his intellectual work in the relative comfort of the museum, the reality at home was grimmer than almost anything he'd experienced before. London's poverty was different from continental poverty, more hidden, more shameful, more isolating. The Marx family was not just poor, but excluded, cut off from respectable society, surviving on the margins. 3 of their children, Guido, born in 1849, Francisca, born in 1851, and Edgar, born in 1847, would die during these terrible years. Victims of malnutrition, of diseases that flourished in London's overcrowded tenements, of medical care the family couldn't afford. Little Guido died at just 1 year old in November 1850. Francisca followed at just 14 months in April 1852. These deaths devastated Jenny and Karl, though they had to grieve while still struggling to feed and care for their surviving children. Marx pawned everything the family owned, again and again. His coat went to the pawnbroker in winter, which meant he couldn't go outside and literally sat shivering at home, unable even to go to the museum. Jenny's family silver, wedding gifts from her aristocratic relatives, disappeared piece by piece into London's pawn shops. Even baby clothes were pawned, borrowed back when needed, pawned again. There's a heartbreaking letter from Jenny to a friend describing how they couldn't afford a coffin when one of their babies died, how she had to beg and plead with neighbours to scrape together enough money for a decent burial. I rushed to a French émigré who lives nearby and who had visited us, she wrote. He gave me £2 immediately. With it, I bought a coffin. The shame of poverty weighed heavily on Jenny especially. She'd been raised in an aristocratic household, had married expecting hardship, but perhaps not understanding what true destitution felt like. Yet she never, not once in their long marriage, blamed Karl or suggested he give up his work for regular employment. She believed in him, in his genius, in the importance of what he was trying to do. Marx wrote articles for the New York Tribune under the pseudonym A London Correspondent, producing ironic dispatches about European politics that paid just enough to keep the bailiffs at bay. Sometimes. The Tribune paid $5 per article, which sounds like nothing but was actually a significant sum. At the height of his relationship with the paper, he was contributing several articles per week. The problem was that the Tribune was inconsistent, sometimes printing his articles, sometimes not, and payment was equally unreliable. Jenny, once a Prussian aristocrat's daughter who'd never had to think about money, learned to stretch a single loaf of bread across 3 days. Her hands, which had once been cared for with creams and gloves, became red and cracked from scrubbing clothes in the shared wash tub in the building's courtyard, from doing all the household labour that a bourgeois family would have had servants for. Yet in this private darkness, in this daily struggle for survival, Marx was assembling what would become his life's work. The notes he scribbled in the museum, filled with equations tracking cotton prices alongside worker starvation, documenting the accumulation of wealth at one end and misery at the other, were the first threads of what would become Das Kapital, capital. He wrote in a kind of frenzy when he could, often standing at his makeshift desk to stay awake, his children's coughs drifting through the thin walls. The work was interrupted constantly, by creditors pounding on the door, by illness, by his own physical ailments, by the simple necessity of somehow finding money for food. When little Edgar died in 1855, at just 8 years old, the child who'd shown the most intellectual promise, who'd been his father's favourite, Marx, was inconsolable. He wrote to Engels, "The house is naturally quite desolate and forlorn, since the death of the dear child who was its life and soul. It's impossible to describe how much we miss him all the time. I have been through a pile of misery, but only now do I know what real unhappiness is." Yet, even in his grief, he added, "Amid all the terrible torments I've been suffering these days, the thought of you and your friendship has always kept me going, and the hope that together we may still do something sensible in the world." He threw himself back into work, telling Engels he had to save what can still be saved. The manuscript of Capital grew in fits and starts, interrupted by boils on his skin, painful carbuncles that were nervous eruptions from stress and poor diet, and by squabbles with other exiled revolutionaries who accused him of abandoning practical politics for abstract theory. The boils were particularly awful. They covered his body at various times. His back, his buttocks, his groin. They made sitting impossible, writing torture. His letters to Engels from this period are full of graphic descriptions of these afflictions, often with Marx's dark humour. "I can only write standing up," he informed Engels in one letter. "The boils have spread to my ass." Through it all, Engels remained the financial lifeline, though he was trapped in Manchester, managing the Ehrman and Engels textile firm he loathed, spending his days overseeing the very exploitation he and Marx were critiquing. His monthly remittances, Marx's sardonic term for the money Engels sent, arrived with reasonable regularity, though never quite enough and never quite on time. Their letters from this period chronicle the absurd duality of their lives. Engels would describe textile profits, market conditions, the mundane details of running a business, all while funding Marx's rent and groceries. Marx would detail his latest discoveries about surplus value, the hidden theft embedded in every capitalist transaction, while simultaneously begging for another £5 to pay the butcher. "Dear Fred," Marx would write, using Engels's English nickname, "I am in the most terrible straits. The butcher has threatened to cut off credit. Could you possibly send Fiat on by Thursday?" And Engels would respond with the money and encouragement. "Continue your work. It's the most important thing. The money is nothing." By 1857, a global financial crash, the first truly international economic crisis of the capitalist era, sent Marx rushing back to the British Museum with renewed urgency and excitement. "The deluge is coming," he wrote to Engels, convinced that capitalism's contradictions would finally explode in a revolutionary crisis. He worked himself nearly to death, writing what he called the Grundrisse, the foundations, a massive, sprawling manuscript of economic analysis that he saw as preparation for capital. But instead of revolution, the crisis passed. The system adapted. Factories reopened. Credit flowed again. And Marx, still unpublished in his major work, found himself again at square one with another economic crisis that had failed to produce revolution. But something had shifted in those years of quiet desperation in the British Museum. The man who emerged from the 1850s was no longer the fiery young journalist of 1848, no longer the revolutionary expecting imminent upheaval. He had become a scholar who had stared into capital's abyss and begun mapping its contours with systematic precision. The first volume of Capital remained unfinished, its pages stained with tea and tobacco, covered with revisions and second thoughts. But its central insight now burned clear. The whole system rested on a simple, brutal alchemy, the conversion of human sweat into gold, of living labour into dead capital, of workers' lifetime into owner's profit. And Marx, the eternal exile, the impoverished scholar, the father who had buried 3 children in London's clay, would spend the rest of his life documenting that crime in meticulous, painstaking, world-shattering detail. The work was slow, often agonising, but he persisted, driven by a conviction that understanding the system was the first step toward changing it. The museum prophet continued his daily pilgrimage, continued filling notebooks, continued building his case against capitalism, even as capitalism seemed to be winning every immediate battle. But Marx was playing a longer game, building not for the revolution of next year, but for the revolutions that might come in 50 years, in 100 years after his death. He couldn't know that his greatest impact would indeed come posthumously, that the books he struggled to finish would outlive him by generations, that his seat in the British Museum would become a kind of shrine. For now, there was only the work, the daily grind of research and writing, and the stubborn belief that truth mattered, that understanding mattered, that his suffering and his family's suffering might somehow contribute to a future less cruel than the present he inhabited. By the 1860s, Marx had become a permanent, almost spectral fixture of the British Museum's reading room. The shaggy, ink-stained figure haunting the economic section was now in his 40s. his once dark beard gone increasingly grey, his health deteriorating from years of poverty and overwork. The attendants knew his routine with clockwork precision. Arrive at opening bell, claim seat G7, demand the latest factory inspection reports and parliamentary blue books, and scribble furious notes until his hands cramped and his eyes burned. His beard had gone beyond unruly into something almost mythical, wild, unkempt, often with bits of food caught in it. His clothes were threadbare, patched and repatched by Jenny's skilled but tired hands. His cough, worsened by London's notorious pea soup fog and decades of cigar smoking, echoed through the reading room. Other scholars learned to recognise that cough, to know when Marx was present. But his mind burned hotter than ever, consuming books and data at a ferocious rate. On the desk before him, a monstrous manuscript grew and grew, part economic analysis, part historical chronicle, part philosophical treatise, part political polemic. It was like some unholy cross between a PhD dissertation and a Molotov cocktail. Its name, Das Kapital. Its subtitle, A Critique of Political Economy. Its mission, to autopsy capitalism down to its twitching, bloodless heart. To reveal every hidden mechanism, every exploitation, every contradiction. The writing process was equal part scholarly rigour and slapstick tragedy. Marx's carbuncles, those painful boils that had plagued him since the 1850s, flared up whenever he sat too long, forcing him to write standing up like some Victorian-era standing desk enthusiast. The pain was sometimes so severe he couldn't sit at all for weeks, could barely sleep, could only find relief standing or lying on his side. His letters to Engels read like a hypochondriac's diary mixed with economic theory. The damned boils have migrated to my posterior, he'd write, making both thinking and sitting equally impossible. I can only work in brief bursts while standing, which makes developing complex arguments nearly impossible. And yet the bourgeoisie will not wait for my ass to heal before continuing its exploitation. Meanwhile, back at their slightly less poverty-stricken home, they'd moved to a slightly better place in Kentish Town by the early 1860s, thanks to Engels's continued support and a small inheritance from Jenny's mother. Domestic life had become a bizarre blend of bourgeois routine and revolutionary fervour. Jenny tried to maintain some semblance of normal family life. Breakfast conversations might veer from little Eleanor's piano lessons to the precise rate at which factory owners sucked surplus value from workers' labour. Eleanor, the youngest Marx daughter, called Tussie by the family, who was just 6 when her father was deep in writing Capital, would later recall practising her letters by copying out passages about commodity fetishism. She didn't understand what she was writing, but she wanted to help her father with his important work. Capital wasn't so much written as exhumed, excavated from mountains of data. Each chapter was mined from 20 years of research. Marx filled it with Gothic horror stories of industrial England that read like something from a nightmare. Children's bones softening from phosphorus poisoning in match factories. Seamstresses collapsing dead at their sewing machines after 30-hour rushes to complete orders. Entire families living in what were literally called coffins, wooden boxes in flop houses that could be rented for a penny a night, where you slept sitting up because there wasn't room to lie down. He deployed sarcasm like a surgical scalpel, dedicating pages to mocking the theological niceties of bourgeois economists who treated market laws as natural and eternal as gravity, rather than as human inventions that served specific class interests. When economists claim that profit came from capitalist abstinence and patience in delaying gratification, Marx noted acidly that this made the workers who starved the real capitalists, since they delayed their gratification far more than any factory owner. The book's central metaphor, capital as a vampire draining living labour, wasn't just rhetorical flourish. It was the scream of a man who'd spent too many nights reading factory inspectors' reports by gaslight, who documented case after case of workers literally worked to death, whose blood and sweat and life hours were transformed into profit for people who contributed nothing but ownership. Capital is dead labour, he wrote, that, vampire-like, only lives by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks. The image was visceral, gothic, and precise, vampirism as economic analysis. When Volume 1 finally published in September 1867, the silence was almost comical after all the build-up. The initial print run of 1,000 copies gathered dust in Hamburg warehouses. The Times of London, Germany's major newspapers, the influential journals, all ignored it. The most revolutionary book of the century landed with barely a whisper. Even fellow socialists grumbled about its density and difficulty. August Bebel, who would later become a major leader of German social democracy, complained that it gave him splitting headaches. "Can't Marx write anything that doesn't require 3 readings to understand?" he asked a friend. Only Engels truly grasped its explosive potential immediately. He launched what might be history's first guerrilla marketing campaign, writing fake reviews under different pseudonyms in various German papers to drum up interest. He'd praise it in one paper, criticise specific points in another to generate controversy, all to get people talking about it. Slowly, improbably, it found its audience. Self-taught factory workers in Leipzig began poring over its equations after their shifts, puzzling through the labour theory of value and surplus value, seeing their own exploitation laid out in mathematical precision. Russian nihilists and populists smuggled copies past the Tsar's censors. Ironically, the censors initially approved it, thinking it was too dense and academic to be dangerous. Even the odd, curious bourgeois picked up copies, presumably needing help sleeping. The critics who did engage often missed the point entirely. One German reviewer praised Marx's fine literary style while dismissing his economics as hopelessly wrong, like complimenting a guillotine's polished blade while ignoring that it's designed to cut off heads. Others fixated on his supposed materialism, his atheism, his reduction of everything to economics, overlooking the profound human story woven into the economic arguments. What these critics failed to see was that beneath all the data, beneath the equations and the systematic analysis, Marx was charting a system he saw as inherently unstable and self-destructive, marked by widespread alienation and recurring crises. He was documenting not just how capitalism worked, but why it couldn't last, why it contained within itself the seeds of its own eventual overthrow. Through it all, Marx kept revising, expanding, and, in classic Marx fashion, procrastinating on completing volumes 2 and 3. They existed only as chaotic drafts, thousands of pages littered with digressions about medieval land rights, the chemical composition of fertilizer, the rate of profit in the different industries, the transformation of surplus value into various forms. He'd promised Engels just 6 more weeks of edits, then disappear down research rabbit holes for months, emerging with 50 new pages on cotton spinning techniques or the history of money, but zero progress on actually finishing the main argument. The project had become his white whale, his King Lear, his never-ending chess game against an economic system that kept changing its rules. Every time he thought he'd nailed down one aspect of capitalist production, new forms would emerge. Joint stock companies, modern banking, international trade at unprecedented scales. The monster kept evolving, and Marx felt compelled to track every mutation. And yet, for all its unfinished state, for all its difficulty and density, capital achieved something remarkable. It made the invisible visible. It turned the mundane horrors of factory life, the routine exploitation that everyone knew about but nobody quite saw, into evidence of a system built on stolen time and stolen lives. When Manchester textile workers began quoting its passages at union meetings, when German socialists used its formulas to calculate fair wages and argue for the 8-hour day, when Russian students pored over smuggled copies in their study circles, Marx allowed himself rare moments of pride. The book that had begun as a whisper in the British Museum, written by a penniless exile that most respectable society dismissed or ignored, was becoming a weapon in workers' hands. The monster was loose in the world, and nobody, not the capitalists it threatened, not the socialists who struggled to understand it, certainly not the exhausted, ailing philosopher who'd created it, could control where it would go next or how it would be used. But Marx kept working, kept revising, kept adding new material to the unfinished volumes. He worked compulsively, driven by a vision of completing his life's work, of providing the working class movement with a complete scientific understanding of capitalism. He would die still trying to finish, still convinced that just a few more months of work would bring it all together. The man who'd promised a complete systematic critique of political economy would leave behind incomplete drafts that Engels would spend the rest of his own life trying to organise and publish. But Volume 1 stood as his achievement, nearly 1,000 pages of dense analysis that fundamentally changed how people understood the economic system they lived under. London, September 28th, 1864. St. Martin's Hall in Long Acre was packed to capacity, the air buzzing with anticipation and the fervent multilingual discussions of a remarkably diverse assembly. French Proudhonists who believed property was theft, Italian Republicans still dreaming of Mazzini's unified Italy, British trade unionists in Tarbes, their working clothes, practical men suspicious of grand theories, German exiles whose revolutionary zeal had not dimmed since 1848, Polish nationalists fighting for their country's independence from Russian rule. All gathered, all claiming to champion workers' rights, all speaking different languages, literally and figuratively. Karl Marx was there, a pivotal, if initially somewhat reluctant figure in attendance, soon to become the leading mind of what would be called the International Working Men's Association, history's first attempt at a socialist supergroup, a global organisation of the working class. The first international, as it would be known to history, was born from equal parts idealism, desperation, and a growing recognition that capitalism was becoming international, and workers' resistance needed to be international too. European workers were getting crushed between industrial capitalism's gears in every country. English textile mills paid starvation wages. French miners lived like moles underground in company towns. German children were losing fingers in factories. Polish workers were exploited by Russian, German, and Austrian capitalists simultaneously. Marx, now playing elder statesman at 46, saw an opportunity. "We must become the generals of the working class," he told Engels, though neither of them had ever held a gun or organised a strike or done a day of factory work in their lives. But they had something the movement needed: a systematic understanding of how capitalism worked and why workers across borders had common interests. The plan was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so. Unite every radical faction across Europe under one banner, creating a coordinated international movement of workers who could support each other's struggles, share strategies, and eventually overthrow capitalism itself. The problem, which became apparent almost immediately, was that radicals hate unity almost as much as they hate capitalists. Marx's genius in this situation was making the International's founding documents deliberately vague enough to please everyone. The inaugural address and statutes, which Marx drafted in one caffeine-fueled all-night session, promised the emancipation of the working classes without specifying exactly how this would be achieved. It denounced capitalism with Shakespearean flair. "The misery of the working masses has not diminished from 1848 to 1864, Marx wrote, "and yet this period is unrivalled for the development of industry and the growth of commerce," while carefully avoiding incendiary words like revolution or dictatorship of the proletariat. It was revolutionary politics as Rorschach test. French anarchists saw in it decentralised communes and mutual aid. British trade unionists saw better wages and working conditions achieved through organisation and strikes. German socialists saw the seeds of Marx's scientific socialism. Italian republicans saw national liberation movements. Everyone could read their own vision into it, which made agreement possible even if real unity remained elusive. For a glorious few years, from 1864 to about 1871, it actually seemed to work. The International became a clearinghouse for labour unrest across Europe, a way for workers in different countries to coordinate and support each other. When Paris bronze workers went on strike in 1867, London dockers sent funds. When Swiss factory owners cut wages, German pamphlets mysteriously appeared in workers' lunch pails, explaining their rights. When English unions needed theoretical ammunition for their demands, they could call on the International's resources. The International grew rapidly, claiming hundreds of thousands of members, though the actual numbers were always disputed and probably inflated. What mattered was that it represented something new, an organisation that explicitly rejected nationalism and proclaimed that workers had more in common with workers in other countries than with bosses in their own countries. Marx, as the real power behind the International's General Council, though he carefully avoided official leadership positions that would make him a target, spent his days writing addresses, mediating between factions, and secretly manoeuvring to purge certain elements he viewed as counterproductive. His nemesis in this period was Mikhail Bakunin, a bear-sized Russian anarchist with wild ideas and wilder behaviour. Bakunin believed in spontaneous uprisings, the immediate abolition of all states, and direct action. He reportedly ate 12 raw eggs for breakfast, and claimed to be able to go days without sleep when revolutionary action was needed. He was charismatic, passionate, and, in Marx's view, hopelessly naive about how revolutions actually worked. Their ideological feud played out in increasingly petty and personal terms. Marx mocked Bakunin's childish plans for immediate revolution without building working-class organisation first. Bakunin called Marx an authoritarian, accused him of wanting to create a new dictatorship with intellectuals in charge, and, in his more anti-Semitic moments, made references to Marx being a slippery Jew who couldn't be trusted. The conflict came to embody fundamental splits in revolutionary theory that persist to this day. Should workers seize state power and use it to transform society, Marx's position, or should they immediately abolish the state entirely and create decentralized autonomous communities, Bakunin's anarchist position? Should the movement be carefully organized and disciplined, or should it embrace spontaneous revolutionary action? Was theoretical understanding necessary for revolution, or did it just create new hierarchies with intellectuals on top? Marx and Engels viewed Bakunin and his followers as a genuine threat to the International's effectiveness. The anarchists were pulling the movement toward what Marx saw as suicidal adventurism, calling for immediate violent uprisings without adequate preparation or popular support, which would only lead to massacres of workers and setbacks for the movement. The whole experiment came crashing down in 1872 at the Hague Congress. Marx, fearing that Bakunin's faction would win control of the International and turn it away from his vision of organised working-class political action, essentially pulled a corporate takeover. He engineered a vote to have the International's headquarters moved from London to New York City, the 19th century equivalent of transferring your rival's department to Antarctica or Siberia. The move was transparently a way to kill the organisation, rather than to see it fall into anarchist hands. Everyone understood this. With its headquarters in distant America, with no real presence there, the International was effectively dead. It limped along for 4 more years in New York before formally dissolving in 1876, having accomplished far less than its founders had hoped. Yet, like most of Marx's apparent failures, the First International left fingerprints everywhere that would shape the future. It proved that workers could organise across national borders, that international solidarity was possible even if difficult. It turned terms like proletariat, bourgeoisie, class struggle, and exploitation into household words across Europe. It gave us the original leftist infighting playbook. Every socialist schism since, from Trotskyists versus Stalinists to modern democratic socialists versus anarchists, owes something to those smoke-filled rooms where Marx and Bakunin's followers hurled accusations at each other. The International also established crucial precedents that workers needed their own independent political organisations separate from bourgeois liberal parties, that economic demands, like the 8-hour day, should be connected to broader political demands, that theory and practice needed to inform each other. Marx himself was characteristically unsentimental about the collapse. The International has done its work, he shrugged to Engels, already elbowed deep in notes for Capital's next volume, already moving on to the next phase of the struggle. It proved the possibility of international working class organisation. That's enough. Besides, history had a funny way of resurrecting Marx's projects when they were least expected. Just before the International's collapse, Parisian workers had risen up in the Commune, and suddenly everyone was quoting Marx again, seeing his theories validated in the brief explosion of working class power. The International might be dead, but the idea it represented, of workers united across borders against capitalism, had been planted and would keep growing, keep mutating, keep inspiring new attempts at international organisation. The brotherhood of very angry men had torn itself apart, as radical movements often do. But in tearing itself apart, it had scattered seeds that would sprout in unexpected places, in unexpected forms, long after the original organisation was forgotten by all but historians. Paris, March 18th, 1871. The city smells of gunpowder, fresh-baked bread, and possibility. An unlikely combination that perfectly captures the extraordinary moment unfolding. The workers have taken control. Not through some carefully plotted Marxist revolution, not according to any theoretical blueprint, but because the French government has literally fled the capital, abandoning Paris to the Prussians after France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and to its own angry citizens. What emerges in this power vacuum is history's first workers' state, though calling it a state misses how radically different it was from any government before it. The Paris Commune, as it's immediately named, is a chaotic, beautiful, doomed experiment in radical democracy, where waiters debate economic policy in City Hall, where artists redesign school curriculum, where ordinary working people suddenly find themselves running a major European capital. Our bearded theorist in London, reading the news in the Times over breakfast, nearly chokes on his tea when he first hears what's happening. After decades of predicting proletarian revolution, after writing thousands of pages about how it would happen, here it is, unfolding spontaneously, messily, and completely contrary to all his careful theories about historical development and the necessary stages of revolution. The communards haven't read Capital, still barely selling. They haven't waited for historical conditions to ripen according to Marx's schema. They haven't even consulted him, haven't sent a delegation to London asking the great theorist what they should do next. They're just doing it, making it up as they go along, improvising the revolution. For 2 months, from March to May 1871, Marx oscillates wildly between exhilaration and sheer panic. He fires off letters to Paris that arrive too late to matter, filled with advice the communards never receive or ignore. He reads every newspaper account he can get his hands on, tracking developments street by street, decree by decree. The commune's innovations read like a socialist fever dream brought to life. Factories abandoned by fleeing owners are seized and turned into worker cooperatives, run democratically by the people who actually do the work. Church property, long used to prop up conservative ideology and aristocratic privilege, is redistributed. The standing army, which everyone recognises has been used primarily to crush workers' movements, is abolished and replaced by a national guard made up of ordinary citizens. All elected officials, from the commune council members down to administrators, are paid workers' wages, no more than a skilled labourer makes. They can be instantly recalled by their constituents if they fail to represent them properly. It's direct democracy on a scale never before attempted in a major city. Women play unprecedented roles. Natalie Lemmel, a bookbinder and Hungarian midwife turned revolutionary, organises free communal kitchens to feed the city. Louise Michel, a radical schoolteacher who dresses in men's military uniform, leads women's battalions to the barricades when government forces attack. Elizabeth Dmitriev, a young Russian aristocrat turned socialist, founds the Union of Women for the Defence of Paris and Care of the Injured. The Louvre, that temple of high culture and aristocratic taste, becomes a political club where artists and workers debate together. The Commune decrees separation of church and state, free education for all children, abolition of night work for bakers, a long-standing demand, and postponement of debt payments. It's 8 weeks of compressed revolutionary experimentation. Back in London, Engels paces their cramped study like an expectant father, gleefully updating battle maps as if watching a particularly exciting football match. "They're holding Montmartre," he crows one day, only to groan the next evening, "The Versaillais have retaken the cannons at Meudon." Marx, meanwhile, scribbles furious notes for what will become the Civil War in France, his analysis of the unfolding drama. His writing captures the Commune's tragic beauty, calling it the glorious harbinger of a new society, even as he knows with sick certainty how this story must end. The French government has retreated to Versailles, is gathering its forces, is preparing a brutal assault to retake the capital, and the communards, brave and idealistic but militarily outmatched, are not prepared for what's coming. His analysis is remarkably even-handed given his partisan position. He praises the Commune's achievements, but also notes its mistakes. Its failure to march on Versailles immediately when it had the chance, its hesitation to seize the Bank of France, and thus control the financial resources that are being used against it, its perhaps excessive faith in formal democratic procedures when faced with an enemy that recognised no such constraints. And oh, how it ends. In late May, government troops under Marshal MacMahon storm Paris in what becomes known as Bloody Week, La Semaine Sanglante. The brutality shocks even veteran war correspondents who'd covered battles across Europe. The cobblestones of Paris run red with workers' blood, as somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 communards are executed in a single week. Women are gunned down, clutching their children. Suspected radicals are lined up against what becomes known as the Mur des Fédérés, the Federalists' Wall, in Père Lachaise Cemetery, and shot so efficiently that the wall still stands today, pockmarked with bullet holes, a pilgrimage site for socialists and anarchists. The Seine, witnesses claim, flows visibly crimson for days with the blood of executed communards. Anyone found with gunpowder stains on their hands is assumed to have fought for the Commune and is executed on the spot. Anyone whose hands are not, calloused, suggesting they're an intellectual rather than a manual worker, is suspected of being a Commune organiser and executed. Thousands more are deported to penal colonies in New Caledonia, where many die from disease and harsh conditions. The repression is so savage, so thorough, so disproportionate to any actual threat the Commune posed, that it traumatises the French working class movement for a generation. When the smoke clears and the bodies are counted, the French Third Republic has drowned the revolution in blood more thoroughly than any previous French government had managed. Marx's pamphlet, The Civil War in France, published just weeks after the Commune's fall, becomes required reading for radicals worldwide. His description of the Commune as the finally discovered political form under which to work out the economic emancipation of labour gets quoted in every revolutionary circle from St. Petersburg to Chicago to Mexico City. But privately, in letters to Engels and to trusted friends, Marx is shaken to his core. The workers had their chance and were massacred for it. The brief glimpse of what a workers' state might look like has been extinguished in blood and fire. The old man spends weeks staring at Parisian newspapers, tracing the execution lists with trembling fingers, recognising names of people he'd met, corresponded with, whose letters sat unanswered on his desk. The legacy of those 72 days will haunt socialist movements forever. Lenin will study the Commune's mistakes obsessively before 1917, determined not to repeat them. He'll note the communards' fatal hesitations, their excessive mercy toward their enemies, their failure to create a disciplined military force. The Bolsheviks will deliberately design their revolution to avoid these errors, which will create its own problems and tragedies. Mao will cite the Commune's example in theorising about People's War and revolutionary base areas. Even today, more than 150 years later, the phrase Paris Commune conjures both revolutionary romance and brutal cautionary tale, proof that workers can govern themselves, and proof of what capitalist states will do to prevent it. As for Marx, he's left with a profound paradox that will trouble his remaining years. History had finally followed his script, had briefly created that dictatorship of the proletariat he'd theorised about, though the communards themselves never used that unfortunate phrase. Only instead of inaugurating a new epoch, it had been drowned in blood after just 2 months. The next revolution, he realises with grim clarity, will need more than barricades and good intentions and democratic idealism. It will need what the communards lacked: military organisation, ruthless discipline, a willingness to use force as efficiently as the enemy. It will need, in short, to be less democratic, less spontaneous, less trusting. Precisely the qualities that had made the Commune so inspiring in the first place. It's a realisation that will shape revolutionary theory and practice going forward, with consequences Marx himself couldn't foresee, couldn't live to see. The Commune's failure will help produce the hard, disciplined, centralised revolutionary parties of the 20th century, with all their achievements and all their crimes. But in the spring of 1871, as Parisian workers' blood soaks into cobblestones that have seen so many revolutions and counter-revolutions, Marx simply grieves. He grieves for the dead, for the defeated, for the lost possibilities. And he returns to his desk, to his endless revisions of Capital, to the work of understanding a system that defends itself with such savage violence when threatened. The revolution had come and gone in 72 days. The old mole of history, as Marx liked to call the revolutionary impulse, was still digging beneath the surface. But it would need to dig deeper, dig smarter, before it emerged again. The 1870s arrived like a slow-motion avalanche of bad news, piling on top of Marx with inexorable weight. His body is falling apart piece by piece, system by system. His lungs wheeze like broken bellows, making it painful to climb stairs or walk more than a few blocks. His skin erupts regularly in angry, painful boils that make sitting or lying down torture. His liver, pickled by decades of stress, poverty, overwork, and probably too much wine and cigars, has apparently declared independence from the rest of his body, causing chronic pain and digestive problems. "I am a machine condemned to devour books and then return them, changed, to the dunghill," he writes with his characteristic dark humour to Engels. "And now the damn machine is breaking down." But Jenny's cough worries him more than his own ailments. His wife of nearly 40 years, the Prussian aristocrat's daughter who chose exile and poverty beside him, who stood by him through everything, now moves through their London home like a fragile ghost. The woman who once hosted Europe's radicals in her parlour while quietly pawning the family silver, who managed to maintain grace and dignity through crushing poverty, can barely climb stairs without stopping to catch her breath. Marx reads her old letters when he can't sleep, increasingly often now. The passionate, romantic notes from their youth, when everything seemed possible. The frantic, desperate ones from their early exile years when the children were dying, and they didn't know where the next meal would come from. He reads them and pretends not to notice the blood-stained handkerchiefs Jenny tries to hide in her sewing basket, the telltale signs of consumption slowly consuming her. She's dying, and they both know it. though they don't speak of it directly. Instead, they have careful, tender conversations about their children, their surviving daughters Jenny, Laura and Eleanor, and their grandchildren, about memories of better times, about everything except the obvious. Work becomes Marx's refuge from grief, as it has so often been. The British Museum attendants, now ageing themselves, have grown accustomed over 2 decades to the sight of the shaggy old revolutionary limping to his usual seat, arriving later than he used to, leaving earlier, muttering under his breath about that idiot Bakunin or that fool Proudhon, or sometimes just muttering incoherently. Volume 2 of Capital languishes in draft form after more than a decade of promises to finish it. Its thousands of pages are a chaotic mix of economic formulas, historical digressions, and ranting marginalia where Marx has written things like typical bourgeois nonsense, or here this fool contradicts what he said on page 47. He can't seem to bring the material together into coherent form, can't find the thread that would unite it all. He's become the grand old man of socialism without ever finishing his masterpiece. The movement he inspired keeps evolving without his permission, spinning off in directions he never intended. German Social Democrats, now organised into a real political party, are winning Reichstag seats through electoral politics rather than revolutionary uprisings. They quote him in their pamphlets, but pursue pragmatic reforms rather than system overthrow. Russian radicals write to him constantly as if he's the oracle at Delphi, asking whether Russia's peasant communes could skip the capitalist stage entirely and move directly to socialism. It's an interesting question that challenges his own theories about historical stages, and he spends months drafting and redrafting responses that he never quite finishes. Even the English press has started treating him with a strange new respect, now that he's old and seemingly harmless. The Times runs a profile calling him the most feared thinker in Europe, which would have gotten him immediately expelled a decade earlier, but now just makes him sound like a quaint relic. It's the kind of respectability you get when you're no longer considered dangerous, when you're safely contained in your category of eccentric intellectual. Marx hates it. Then comes the hammer blow that breaks something fundamental in him. Jenny dies on December 2nd, 1881, after months of painful decline. Marx is too ill himself to attend the funeral, lying in bed, listening to the winter rain patter against the window as they bury the woman who was his first editor, his fiercest defender, his partner in every possible sense, his last real tether to ordinary human life and bourgeois respectability. When he finally visits the grave at Highgate Cemetery months later, leaning heavily on daughter Eleanor's arm, he collapses sobbing so violently that the cemetery attendants have to look away in embarrassment. The great theorist of historical materialism reduced to raw grief, clutching at grass and dirt as if he could dig down to her. The Moor is dead too, Engels tells friends afterwards, using their old nickname for Marx, given because of his dark complexion and hair. He's just still breathing. It's truer than Engels knows. The vital spark, the fierce combative energy that drove Marx through decades of poverty and exile has gutted out. He continues to exist, but the life has gone out of him. The end, when it comes 2 years later, on March 14th, 1883, is almost anticlimactic. His housekeeper, Helene de Muth, faithful Lentian, who'd been with the family for decades, who'd managed their household through poverty and raised their children and been Jenny's closest friend, finds him slumped in his favourite armchair by the fire in the late afternoon. There's a half-written page on his lap, yet another note about the Russian peasant question that he'll never finish. The death certificate lists bronchitis and pleurisy as causes of death. But anyone who knew him understood the real cause. 40 years of exile, of grinding poverty, of grief and disappointment and overwork. 40 years of fighting a system that seemed determined to crush anyone who opposed it. 40 years of 16-hour workdays trying to understand and explain how that system worked, trying to arm future revolutionaries with knowledge. The human body can only sustain that kind of intensity for so long. At the funeral in Highgate Cemetery 3 days later, on a cold, drizzly March day, Engels delivers the eulogy to a gathering of just 11 mourners, family, close friends, a few representatives from workers' organisations. His name will endure through the ages, and so also will his work, Engels promises, his voice breaking with emotion. It's unclear if even he believes this fully. The London papers barely note the passing of this notorious agitator, giving him shorter obituaries than minor politicians and society figures who died the same week. The tombstone that's eventually erected, years later, after a more elaborate monument replaces the simple grave marker, bears no mention of specific works, no mention of manifestos or revolutions, just that famous final call to action from the manifesto. Workers of all lands, unite. Back in the empty house on Maitland Park Road in Kentish Town, Engels undertakes his sorrowful duty. He opens the dreaded notebooks, the manuscript pages scattered across Marx's desk and stuffed into boxes and drawers. 2 unfinished volumes of Capital stare back at him in Marx's nearly indecipherable scroll. Decades of work that will need to be organised, edited, completed as much as possible, and published. Engels, the practical one, the organiser, rolls up his sleeves and reaches for the whiskey. He's 62 years old himself, not in great health, and he's just inherited an impossible task: finishing his friend's life work from scattered notes and fragmentary drafts. The revolution, it seems, will need an editor. For the next 12 years, until his own death in 1895, Engels will dedicate himself to this task, producing volumes 2 and 3 of Capital from Marx's chaotic manuscripts, trying to finish what his friend started, trying to honour his memory. He never quite succeeds in making the later volumes as coherent or compelling as Volume 1, because Marx himself had never quite figured out how to resolve all the contradictions and problems he'd identified. But Engels does his best, and in doing so ensures that Marx's work survives, that it reaches future generations who might understand it better or apply it differently than either of them imagined. The old mole has finally stopped digging, but the tunnels he dug through the structure of capitalist society remain, waiting for others to explore them, expand them, perhaps one day use them to finally bring the whole edifice down. Also Engels hopes, as he lights another cigar and returns to deciphering his friend's impossible handwriting, trying to understand what Marx meant by this marginal note or that crossed-out paragraph, trying to complete a life's work from the fragments left behind. More of a messy, contested canonization than the peaceful transition of authority you might imagine. 1880s Europe, groaning under the weight of industrial capitalism's excesses and contradictions, suddenly found itself crawling with Marxists, or at least people who called themselves Marxists, who claimed his authority for their particular version of socialism. In London pubs, German beer halls, French cafes, and Russian study circles, argument erupted constantly over what the old man had really meant. Did he support reformist parliamentary tactics, or only revolutionary insurrection? Did his theories apply to peasant societies like Russia, or only to advanced industrial nations? Was he an economic determinist who thought revolution was inevitable, or did he believe in human agency and choice? People could find quotes to support almost any position because Marx had been prolific, had changed his mind on various points, and had written with different audiences in mind at different times. Engels, now the keeper of the sacred texts and the only person who truly understood Marx's thought in all its complexity, spent his final decade fielding letters from fanatics and skeptics alike. No, he wrote for the 100th time to some over-eager French socialist, Karl did not predict that the revolution would arrive next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Historical materialism is not astrology. He grew increasingly frustrated with people who claimed to be Marxists, but seemed to have understood nothing. All I know is that I am not a Marxist, Marx himself had said late in life, exasperated by some of his French followers. Engels understood that sentiment perfectly now. The movement Marx left behind was splitting at the seams like a cheap suit under stress. In Germany, Edward Bernstein, once Engels' protégé, argued that capitalism could be gradually reformed through parliamentary democracy, that revolution wasn't necessary, that workers were actually getting better off through trade unions and social legislation. This, revisionism, earned him the nickname Evolutionary Eddie from more radical comrades and furious denunciations from those who insisted Marx had proven capitalism must be violently overthrown. In Russia, a young firebrand named Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, later known as Lenin, pored over capital in Siberian exile, scribbling notes about how to adapt Marx's theories to Russian conditions. If capitalism was necessary before socialism, but Russia was still mostly peasant and feudal, how could revolution happen there? Lenin's answer: skip steps, telescope history, use a disciplined revolutionary party as the agent of change rather than waiting for objective conditions to ripen. Meanwhile, anarchists and utopian socialists kept trying to claim Marx's legacy for their own purposes, much to Engels' profound irritation. It's like watching children divide up an inheritance before the will has even been read, he grumbled to a friend. They're fighting over what they think Marx meant, while ignoring what he actually wrote. By the 1890s, Marx's ideas were undergoing the ultimate irony, becoming respectable. German Social Democrats won Reichstag seats using his rhetoric while pursuing moderate reforms. British Fabians like George Bernard Shaw quoted him at middle-class tea parties while advocating gradual municipal socialism. Even the odd, brave university professor began teaching capital, though usually with the careful disclaimer that it was purely academic and historically interesting rather than a call to action. The books that had gathered dust in warehouses 20 years earlier now went through multiple printings and translations. Workers and intellectuals across Europe read them, argued about them, annotated them. Those first editions that Engels had hawked like snake oil, trying to generate interest through fake reviews, were now valuable collector's items. The real turning point in Marx's posthumous career came in 1895 when Engels published Volume 3 of Capital, that Frankenstein's monster of a book stitched together from decades of Marx's notes, drafts, and fragmentary manuscripts. Critics immediately pounced on its contradictions and unresolved problems, particularly the famous transformation problem of how values transform into prices, which Marx had promised to solve but never quite did. See, crowed bourgeois economists. His whole system collapses under its own contradictions. They didn't realise, or chose not to realise, that they were arguing with a ghost, with incomplete drafts that Marx himself might have revised completely if he'd lived to finish them. Marxist economists spent the next century trying to solve the transformation problem and defend Marx's theory of value. The debate became so technical and mathematical that it lost connection to the political project Marx had always seen as central. But it also showed that Marx's work was being taken seriously as economics, not just dismissed as political propaganda. Then came the test of revolutionary practice. The 1905 Russian Revolution, though ultimately crushed, proved that workers could rise up, could create their own organisations, the Soviets, workers' councils, could shake even the mighty Tsarist autocracy. Lenin's Bolshevik faction took careful notes, studying what had worked and what had failed, reading and rereading Marx's analyses of previous revolutions. By 1914, the European socialist movement faced its greatest crisis and revealed its greatest weakness. When World War I broke out, the great socialist parties that had spent decades preaching international working class solidarity mostly collapsed into nationalist support for their own country's war efforts. German socialists voted for war credits to fight French workers. French socialists rallied to fight German workers. The dream of international worker unity that Marx and Engels had devoted their lives to seemed to have died in the trenches of the Western Front. It appeared to vindicate Marx's critics. National identity, it seemed, was stronger than class identity. Workers would kill other workers for king and country before they'd unite against their own bourgeoisie. The Second International collapsed in ignominy, seemingly proving that Marx's vision of international worker solidarity was a utopian fantasy. But in Zurich, a certain bold revolutionary living in exile took a different lesson. Lenin pored over Marx's writings on imperialism and colonialism, Engels' late work on military affairs, Marx's analyses of how ruling classes used nationalism and war. Imperialism is capitalism's highest stage, Lenin wrote, giving Marx's theories a fresh coat of paint for the new century, extending them to explain how advanced capitalism had evolved into global imperial competition that made war inevitable. Then came 1917, when the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd. They did it explicitly under Marx's banner. His face adorned their posters. His phrases filled their decrees. His analysis of capitalism and class struggle provided the theoretical foundation for the first successful socialist revolution. The man who'd spent his life as a penniless exile in London was now the patron saint of a worker state spanning 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. And so, as the 20th century unfolded, Marx's ideas, born from libraries, ink, and debate, became tools wielded by states, movements, and revolutions he never lived to witness. Some used them to seek justice. Others twisted them into instruments of fear. What began as a theory of liberation became, in many places, a blueprint for control. History rarely gives us the endings we expect. If you enjoyed this journey through the past and want to explore more stories that shaped our world, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss a new episode. Thanks for watching, and until next time, sleep well.